In the early centuries of the Greco-Roman world, unwanted babies were dumped and left to die. You could literally just leave your baby in the gutter and no one would think less of you for it. It was called exposure, and back then it was no big deal. Without the idea that everyone was made in God's image, unwanted babies were not seen as valuable in their own right. Today, of course, people would be criminally charged for this. Reading stories like this shows us why knowing our history is so important. It shows us how our thinking has changed over time, how our worldview shapes our actions, and it puts our current ideas about God and the world into perspective. This then helps us to be part of shaping a better future. It's why we all need to be students of history. Or as Winston Churchill said in a 1948 speech to the British House of Commons, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. History can be a hard read because the church hasn't always done a sterling job. Historian John Dixon talks about the bullies and the saints of history. He aims to be fair and honest about when the church acted as saints in life-giving ways, the feel-good part, and when they became power-intoxicated and violent bullies, the devastating part. Let me give you some examples from history that we can learn from. First of all, we learn that not everyone always believed in the value of people in human rights. In fact, in the world of the early church, this was a novel idea. The Romans thought that only the rich and powerful had value. But Christians and Jews based their ideas on Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, where it says that both men and women are made in the image of God and therefore worthy of dignity, worthy of treatment, of love and kindness and physical needs being met. This was a radical idea. Even in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it says it's self-evident. Well, it's self-evident with a history of Genesis in mind, but perhaps not without it. Another example of history in our perspective is in the whole area of charity. It's really significant that the early Christians took Jesus's words that he'd come to heal the sick and set the captives free, to bring good news to the poor. And so the early Christians took on the poor as their responsibility. If you were going to be baptized in the early church, you had to commit to care for the poor. The first hospital that was ever built with universal healthcare was built by a bishop in 370 AD. And in fact, the hospitals after them were also led by the church. Until centuries later, the government followed on. During medieval times, church law required that 25% of income went to the poor. And if it wasn't, the church leaders would be charged for it. They understood what it meant to take Jesus' teaching seriously. And so the whole idea of charity became something that developed in our Western society. Another lesson from history. Think about our perspective of war. In the early church and for the first 3 centuries, Christians refused to engage in violence of any sort. They believed Jesus' words to love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you, and therefore you couldn't kill them. It wasn't until the 4th century, when the power of the state and the church came together, that this view shifted. Can you see how our perspective has changed in history? Can you see some of the lessons that we can learn from those who have gone before us and why we think the way we do? It calls us to a lesson of humility. It calls us to look at our own perspectives today and think about, well, where have I got it wrong? Where am I practicing the words of Jesus? What can I learn from those who have come before us? How can history teach me to avoid the problems of the past? It's been wonderful to have you listen in on Everyday God Conversations today. If you'd like to have more of your own God Conversations, go to godconversations.com.